Now, in the further module, that is the lecture 14, I would like to discuss the lecture method and the video method, how we can make the presentations through these different types of the training techniques and tools. It is very important that whenever we are talking about the traditional training methods, in the traditional training methods are they organized into three broad categories: presentation methods, hands on methods and group building methods. Earlier I remember that is these presentation methods were done with the help of the transparencies. On the transparencies we were writing by the sketch pens and then they were demonstrated on the projector and then the presentation was done for a particular topic. The lecture method was very common and then it was used in a traditional method, but at that time the more the blackboard and the chalks those have been used for these particular lecture methods are there. Now, here whenever we are talking about the presentation methods in which the trainees are the passive recipients of information, then this information may include the facts, processes and problem solving methods. So, lectures and audio visual techniques are presentation methods which are I will be discussing into this particular session. It is important to note that the instructor led classroom presentation methods may include lectures, videos, workbooks, manuals and earlier the CD-ROMs and games are there. That is, a mix of methods can actually engage trainees in learning and can help transfer of training to occur. The basic concept behind a lecture method is to be active learning. The active learning means that is it should not be only through the communication by the teacher or the trainer, but it has to be keeping engaged the learners. Whenever trainers when he is going only through the lectures, then in that case the hearing after 20 minutes or 40 minutes the trainee may not be able to concentrate. It depends from individual to individual. 20 to 40 minutes normally may be the concentration, the maximum concentration of the learner. But when we are talking about the sessions, then in the sessions of that particular 90 minutes or the 60 minutes or more than that, then 120 minutes, then in that case that has to be more and more interactive. The concept of active learning will be possible only through that the persons are kept involved, the learners are kept involved in this particular training method. For this purpose, whenever we have to design the lecture. Now, here I would like to mention that is the session plans are to be very carefully to be designed. Whenever we are conducting a training program, normally the training programs that can be of the 2 days, 3 days or the 5 days, 1 week. 1 week training programs are there. And in that 1 week training programs, the training methods and techniques which we are going to use, then naturally the first and foremost is the lecture method. The trainers communicate through spoken words what they want the trainees to learn, and most of the time these are the theoretical concepts, the theory models. So, these theory models are discussed in the beginning of the lecture and the concepts are created and designed and formulated with the trainees. So, that what they are going to learn, what is the theoretical base. The theoretical framework is very important. How we design the theoretical framework. For theoretical framework, we are having the different resources. I will be talking about different resources in this particular lecture method. The communication of learned capabilities is primarily one way from the trainer to the audience if it is only through the spoken words. Through the spoken words, the person, the trainer, he can engage the employees for 40 minutes to 45 minutes maximum. Instructor-led classrooms presentation remains a popular training method despite new technologies. Now, here we cannot ignore the importance of the trainer while interacting with the training. Through this spoken words training, the trainee, they are required to understand that this theoretical framework, if there is any particular challenge, particular doubt especially, then the trainee is supposed to ask to the trainer, that is how this theoretical framework will be applicable in a practical sense. These new technologies such as popular training methods despite new technologies such as interactive videos and the computer assisted instructions are there, but still there is an importance of the spoken words and where trainees can clear his doubts. A lecture is one of the least expensive, least time consuming ways to present a large amount of information efficiently in an organized manner. So, if the session plan is properly designed, then through the spoken words a trainer can deliver his lecture at the least expensive and the least time consuming methods are there, because he has to share his knowledge, and wherever he is using the new technology, that new technology is facilitator, new technology is not trainer, that the trainer is that particular person who is taking the help of these instruments, these gadgets for the effective and less time consuming process. But this lecture method is having these several disadvantages. Lectures tend to lack participants' involvement if it is for the long time, then feedback and meaningful connection, because it is possible that the trainees they get disconnect with the trainer while there is a long time the lecture method is used. So, therefore, it will be, if we want to have a meaningful connection to the work environment, it becomes very important, that is we are making the combination of the different methods in the lecture methods, all of which inhibit learning and transfer of training. So, basic purpose of transfer of knowledge, that is the TOK, is possible only when we talk about the development of these lectures with the help of different equipments. The lectures appeal to few of the trainees' senses because trainees focus primarily on hearing information. So, when we talk about the learning theories, learning methods, and therefore, the first and foremost method is, that is the hearing information. So, we cannot ignore the importance of the lecture in the beginning, and therefore, we talk about, that is the how that hearing information that can be taken place while ever interacting in a effective lecture session. Lectures also make it difficult for the trainer to judge quickly and efficiently the learner's level of understanding. So, if it is only the spoken words from the one side, then learner will not be able to understand, and especially immediately, that is whether the learner is having that capacity to understand the level, to come to that level what concept he is talking to, and therefore, these disadvantages of the lecture methods that can be compensated with the help of the use of technology. To overcome these problems, the lecture is often supplemented with the question and answer periods. So, therefore, the trainer also learns, that is the whether whatever he has talked that has been absorbed or not, and whether this has been absorbed correctly or not. So, that particular aspect that can be checked with the help of question answer sessions. Now, here I would like to share my experience with the Hanyang University Korea, where I teach this Asian business. It has been observed, that is the whenever we are having the particular session, in the session the many times they ask questions in between. So, this question answer session will definitely will be helpful, but trainer should be enough smart to administer, that is the when the questions are to be asked. Many times if it is not properly managed, this question answer session which is normally kept at the end, but every system is having its advantages and disadvantages. If it is a long lecture and at the end you ask the question answers because of their personal interest and needs, then they may not ask the questions because already the long time has been covered. So there can be the question answer sessions with the short intervals, but that control that question answer session, that is the responsibility of the trainer, so that he can again direct his lecture towards the audience. Otherwise this question answer session that may disrupt the continuity of the lecture. These techniques allow the trainer to build into the lecture more active participation, as I mentioned about the active learning concept. Job related examples. Now trainer is expected to know the academic background and the profile background of the participants. Trainer should ensure that to whom he is addressing, what will be their academic background and what will be their professional background, and in that case if he understands the needs, he can relate the suitable examples. For example, it is a heterogeneous group, that is the participants are coming from the different nature of industries, then he can give the examples which will be more generic, and that will be, for example, I would like to mention about the leadership. When we will talk about the leadership, we will talk about the generic in the leadership. But when the participants are homogeneous group, that is they are coming from the same nature of industries, then suitable examples will be from the same nature of industries. In that case, trainees, participants will be able to connect themselves with that particular type of the training program. Here for interactive learning, active learning, we can use the exercises. How the exercises are to be used and when it is to be used, that I will discuss when subsequently when I will discuss in further session about the use of exercises. Through the active participation, job related examples allow them to ask the question and answers, and using the exercises which will facilitate learning and transfer of training to the particular trainees, and the trainer will be have the effective lecture. Now the lectures can be of the many types. Some of the types are standard lecture, where the trainer talks while trainees listen and absorbs information, and in that case that is the experience sharing. This becomes the more and more important. If the trainer is more experienced and he is talking to the audience with the, in addition to his theoretical framework and theoretical theory, suppose he is talking about the personality and the behavior, then he is making the types of personalities, what is a personality, and then how the personalities, the attributes of the personalities, the determinants of personalities, and then that will be the standard lecture of the on the personality. The trainer will talk about the personality. When we talk about the team teaching, here two or more trainers present, different topics or alternative views of the same topic. So here whenever we club, that is the HR with the economics, and when the economist talks about the future of economy, and then the HR talks about that is how the change of HR is required with the change into the economy. Now these two experts, they can connect together and deliver the lecture. Sometimes very common practices is of the technology and management. Whenever we talk about a particular technology, then in that case the lectures are given on the how this particular technology is going to affect the manpower. How to make the best use of the technology, how to train into the technology, what are the future challenges in technology. Simple example is of artificial intelligence. Whenever we are talking about the artificial intelligence and its application, then what will be the impact if more and more use of the artificial intelligence, then what will be the impact on human resource, and that part will be discussed with the HR faculty, HR trainer, and the person who is from the artificial intelligence, he will talk about the role and responsibilities in the future, yesterday, today and tomorrow of the technology. Example is artificial intelligence. Now, in this team teaching, the another person who is from the HR, another trainer who is from the HR, he will supplement. If these are the issues into the artificial intelligence, then how the person will be able to deliver that particular task. If that much technology is complex, then the employees, how they have to develop, how they have to face the situation, and what competency they are required to develop if to match this the higher level of the artificial intelligence. When there will be the match between the artificial intelligence of an organization and level of the employees competency, that will develop the team teaching. The third type of the lecture is, that is the guest speakers. Speaker visits the session for a predetermined time period and the primary instruction is conducted by the instructor. So, therefore, in that case it is very popular, that is in case of the learning. For example, nowadays even in the conference we will find that is the workshops are organized for the entrepreneurship and the research methodology workshops. This type of the workshops which will introduce with the expertise people, which will allow the participants to learn from these experts, those who are coming from the industries, even entrepreneurships even, and then they are generating an interest, that is the how with the research learning in a conference, how they can learn this particular entrepreneurship and these technology based workshops they can use for their research purpose. The guest speakers, for example, if we are conducting a training program for a particular energy, environment or agriculture related industry, then the experts in addition to trainer keep the sessions in between. If it is a 3 days, 5 days training program, then he can keep the one session with the guest speakers, and this guest speaker will be the executive or experienced person of that particular connected stakeholder with that particular nature of industry. If he is from that particular nature of industry, then definitely he can be invited, he will share his expertise related to that particular training program. As I mentioned, that is when we have conducted the RRVPNL, Rajasthan Rajya Vidyut Prasaran Nigam Limited training programs, and during that training programs we have at Jaipur we have also invited the Professor Uday Parekh sir, and then he was there as a guest speaker and introduced and talked about that particular training program. Then we can also organize the panel discussions. The panels will be there 2 or more speakers present in the information and asking the questions, and if these 2 more speakers are there, they will talk about this particular information and the panelists will be present, and then they will satisfy the query of these trainees, and this also becomes a wonderful type of the training program where, and these panelists will be from the subject experts with the industry experts and from the government. So, industry, academia and government, this type of the panelists that can be created, and the panels will be more and more capable to share their experiences, that is how industry is working, academician is related with these concepts, how these concepts are relating to with the particular industry. For example, we talk about that is the conflict management, and then the concepts of the conflict management, conflict models and stress management that can be discussed, and then industry person can talk about that is the how the stress management that is practiced into the organization, and what type of the stress nowadays are becoming very common, and how we can create the happiness index in that particular organization. So, this type of the panel can be created. If it is related with the RTI or related to any particular finance, then definitely the expert from government that he can also talk about the rules and regulations, that is the what government's policy is there on this particular type of issues. Next is student presentations, that is the groups of trainees present topic to the class. This is also a very common method and very effective method. Whenever we talk about the active learning, in active learning method, these practices, they are wonderful examples, that is the type of lectures which we can organize, that is the how the groups of trainees they present topic to the class, and that can be any case study is given, or they have been asked to design an enterprise, or they have asked to make a particular problem solving approach. If they are asked to give any exercise, they have to come group case study analysis, they have to come forward, and then they have to share, and the expert will give their comments, and then that will become the very popular type of the many management institutes, leading management institutes, they are using the case study methods as the students presentation or the learners presentations, and that can be used. Now, after the delivery of these lectures and types of the lectures, now I will also like specially mention, that is the how to prepare the content for a good lecture. We have to see that what is the topic and title of that particular training program, and we have to refer the books. If we refer a very prominent books which has been well accepted into the these particular universities or top institutes where they are giving in the references. If it is a behavior science, it is human resource management, it is technology management, it is knowledge management, then we have to find out the top 10 books of this particular topic, and maybe the subtopic under this particular umbrellas. Then we have to find out which are the best books are available, and then those books are to be referred, those models are to be discussed, and that the recent books, the recent editions. For example, the training program is for like I conduct training program for the Munjal groups, then in that case it is a change management, and if the change management is there, the latest books are to be referred. Then we have to also connect these books of the change management with the OD's book, organization development books, and therefore then we can conduct this type of the training programs based on the sources is from the books. But only books will not be enough. In what I will suggest, that is please also refer the journals. Which are the journals? Journals nowadays, that is we are talking about the Scopus listed, SSCI listed, AVDC listed, and therefore those journals will be the authenticate source for this particular type of the training programs, and we can take the research input. What the books will give us the theoretical input, and the journals the latest research input, there are also those studies, research papers, those studies that we can also incorporate into the journals. And the third one is there is a different case studies. Now, we can there are number of websites of the leading institutes, those who are providing the case studies, and those case studies that can be used. The further sessions will be, that is 16, 17, 18, 19, the 4 sessions will be on the case writing workshop, how to conduct the case writing workshop, and then how to do the case analysis, that I will be discussing. As I mentioned, that is the trainees, they are able to connect themselves with the help of live industry examples, and through the live industry examples they will be able to connect themselves that these are the problems, then how they can connect with this particular situation and find out the solution to the problem, at least the approach. That approach will be becoming very important, that what will be the approach. So, this was the some input on the lecture methods. Now, the another method of training, and that is the audio visual instructions. Now, whenever I say that is the actual learning is to be there, then in that case the actual learning will be in audio visual instruction, that includes the overheads, the slides and videos. So, thanks to the technology, nowadays we are having the number of videos which are available, but I am very happy to share with you that is in my class I always ask the participants to make their own video and then they share the video given a situation, a case study method, a case situation, a problem situation, and then they develop. If our training program that is of the 5 days, then it will be wonderful idea, that is the half day on one of the days you can keep for the video making. The participants are supposed to make the video and then they have to demonstrate that particular video, and that role playing may be a business game, maybe or the industries and the problem, a situation, behavior modeling, whatever it is for purpose the training program is there, but ask participant to develop a video and then demonstrate the video. And I will be showing that one video by my students in the further slides. Video is a popular instructional method. It has been used for improving the communication skills, interviewing skills and customer service skills, and by this purpose we can make the use of the better communication. How do they communicate? Then their body language, their tone, pitch, voice, that we can show. The interviewing skill, that is the how interview is conducted, and that can be the also a beautiful video. And if any training program is related to any customer service skills, then definitely that also we can demonstrate. And for illustrating how procedures, example, that is the welding, that in technical process that should be also followed, and through the help of the technology video we can make them comfortable, that is how technology works. Video is however rarely used alone, because video without any context that you cannot show or ask them to make, because keep in mind that is every training program is not only for the active learning, but it is also for the useful whatever has been learned. It is usually used in conjunction with the lectures to show trainees real life experiences and examples. So, we will see how to use the audio visuals in the training class. First step, assign the activity to participants, such as it is related to the, if for example I have taken recruitment, selection, training and development, then in that case first activity is to the theme, formulation of the theme, formulation of concept, formulation of chapter, that is very important, that is on what chapter that you want to use this particular video. The video technique assignment will be more effective whenever there is an interactive session. However, except in the technology, that is how to make the use of technology, there can be the video, but otherwise the video will be more helpful than if it is an interactive video. Brief participants about activities and how they have to perform that activity in the class. So, guidelines is to be provided, so that while making the video they understand what they are supposed to do. Trainer plays a very important role in this case, and he develops that particular video that we under the guidance of the trainer. Ask participants to make a video of entire activity, then present in class along with the PowerPoint presentation. So, therefore, they have to make a video of entire activity and then connect with the concept, that is along with the PowerPoint presentation they are supposed to connect. Now, here I would like to show a video which we have developed with the help of the students in the classroom, and then we can go for that particular company video.
Ingress Securities, the way to financial growth. We at Ingress Securities believe that investor security comes before our profits. Our company was founded by Dr. Santosh Angnekar. Safeguarding interests of investors is our prime objective.
We are present in 9 cities and serve 1 lakh clients dedicatedly. With the foresight of achieving an ever-growing business status, our company was awarded with Emerging Wealth Management House Award consecutively in 2 years, in 2014 and 2015.
We provide best-in-class wealth and asset management services for both organizations and individuals. Our clients include Samsung, Reebok, Adidas, Sapient, Jubilant Foods.
We aim at building community at our workplace. Our HR policy is driven by our vision and core values of promoting transparency and voice of our employees.
Our core values are
financial security of our clients,
client focused,
excellence in all we do,
Integrity always,
respect for individual and for the community in which we live and work.
Now, as you have seen in this particular video, that is how the students have been given instruction that what role they have to play and then they have to demonstrate. So, this is enhancing the video making and the role playing capacity. Oregon is one of only a few ready mix firms in the Northwest that provides the regular training for their drivers. And Morse Brothers have been able to reduce cost and raise customer satisfaction by providing drivers with product training and by instructing drivers to avoid the rollovers and excessive idling at construction sites. What method does Morse Brothers use to train its drivers? The company produced training videos that are presented by the mentor drivers, and then they talk about mentor's driver job is to select the weekly video, scheduled viewing sessions, keep attendance records and guide a wrap-up discussion following each video. And in these videos they talk about that is how efficiently and effective the driving is to be done, and if there are any problems are arising, then how to handle those particular problems. So, therefore, this particular company in the training program of their drivers, they are making the use of the videos. The mentor drivers are trained to call attention to key learning points covered in the video and relate the topic to issues the driver deal with on the job. Because training sessions are scheduled early in the morning, at the beginning of the driver's shift, time is limited. Videos seldom run more than 10 minutes. So, in the 10 minutes in the beginning itself, the video will be shown and they have to perform. One called another pair of eyes trains drivers to observe test procedures used by testing agencies at the job sites. And Morse Brothers provides training on test procedures because samples often fail at test due to contamination. Example is that the dirt and that gets into the test cylinder, and this type of the videos definitely that help a driver to work more effectively. Another video emphasizes in this company cold weather precautions. Drain all tanks and horns at the end of the day and park the drum in the neutral. And this type of the training program, that is how carefully they have to do this particular task that has been trained with the help of the videos are there. So, many companies are using, that is not only just for the sharing the information, but how to do that particular task is more effectively, and this will be a very highly educating and supporting for the learners. At each training session, drivers are asked to answer several questions related to the content of the program, and then whatever the task they are supposed to do. So, and when they see the video and if they find that there is some problem, they can ask the questions, and it has been observed that is there are the number of relevant number of questions by the particular by the drivers in this particular training program. At the end of the session, drivers and the mentor drivers discuss anything that might be interfering with the quality of the product or timelines of the delivery. So, after this videos training, as I mentioned, that is these are used for the effective lecture methods for the actual learning, and now they are supposed to go for that how to make that more effective, discussing that problems and with the end of the session with the driver and the learners. Mentor drivers then share this information with company managers, and as a result of which the company managers, they are able to understand that what practical problems are there, what technical issues are there, what behavioral issues are there. By these understanding these issues, they are able to learn, that is how they can develop a video and informing these issues to be resolved in what way, in what manner, and therefore through video the job task of the drivers that has been made much easier than before. So, this is all about, that is the examples of that how the training programs with the audio video that we can use. Most of the problems in result from the creative approach used. These problems include too much content for the trainee to learn. So, therefore, in the case of the lecture as compared to lecture, so you can give the more content, then we can avoid the poor dialogue between the actors which hinders the credibility and clarity of the message, that we can avoid. Overuse of humor or music, that can be avoided, and drama that makes it confusing for the trainees to understand the important learning points emphasized in the video, and therefore, if precautions are taken, that is the what should be the content in spite of the too much content, very relevant content, avoiding the poor dialogues between the actors, those who are playing that particular role in that video, that has to be taken care of. Overuse of humors or music or background music, that is to be avoided, and that we have to create, because it is role playing, behavior modeling. So, it should not be too high dramatic, and then if you otherwise it will make the confusing for the trainees to understand. If this type of the important learning points are taken care of, then definitely the video training, that will be very effective video training. But here we are not only video training is given by showing the video, but also by making the video by the trainers. I am sure that is this type of the methods that will be used by the trainers wherever it is possible and applicable. So, this is about the lectures and training methods which I have talked about how we can use into the training programs. Thank you.